911 operators of Reddit, what are some of the funniest things someone is called in for? I only worked dispatch for a few months and I got a call for a fish being stuck in a woman's ear. My dad used to be in charge of the 911 call center. One particular story I remember was in like '09, some guy called asking how much weed he could have in his car while driving through the state. They went back and forth for maybe 20 minutes of the guy repeating and rephrasing the question, and my dad just responding, "None." I just certified as a call taker and got mandated for overtime, of course, on my first shift. Policy was if someone insisted they saw something, we take it as face value and enter the call. Well, this lady called me just after midnight and swore she saw a chupacabra on the west side of Orlando and insisted in an officer doing an area check. Not too long after that, a coworker was in on his night off and left the building. He called 2 minutes later saying he saw a kangaroo hopping down the street. I can't make this shit up. I've had to call animal control about a chupacabra that was killing all the chickens in my neighborhood. I had caught a glimpse of it a few days before in my backyard and couldn't believe what I was seeing. Then I saw it walking down the street in broad daylight and was able to catch a picture and confirm that I wasn't crazy. They told me they had tons of calls about it and to tell all my neighbors to lock up our chickens, bring in any outside animal food, and that they have live traps set for it all over. Spoiler alert, it was a coyote completely bald from mange and so skinny you would never recognize it. I was glad they already had calls about it. I knew it was not okay, whatever it was, but I had no idea how to describe it aside from El Chupacabra. Thankfully, they knew exactly what I was talking about. One time a guy called in while I was training and stated he had cut his penis. When I answered, "You cut your penis?" the trainer smacked me on the arm and told me he said he'd cut his hand. She looked at me like the biggest pervert. Then, 10 seconds later into the conversation, he says, "Yeah, I was trying on a rubber that was too small and I had to cut it off, so I cut right into my penis." She almost couldn't stop herself from laughing. Lady called in because she thought Willie Nelson was having a cardiac arrest in her trailer, and she needed an ambulance. I started giving her CPR instructions, and come to find out when paramedics got there, she was doing compressions on the couch cushions. I briefly worked as a 911 operator. When someone called on the non-emergency line, we always answered the same way. "Blank, police and fire, this is a recorded line. How can I help you?" We get a call on that line, I answer as usual, and a very inebriated sounding woman asks the following. "Hypothetically speaking, if my boyfriend had a few grams of cocaine and I called the police to tell them about it, would either of us get into any trouble?" "Ma'am, you're calling the police on a recorded line." "I know, but what does the law say?" "I don't know, ma'am. I'm not a police officer. Would you like me to send one?" "Yes, please." She gives me her address. An officer responded, but there were no arrests. That one had me scratching my head. There are funny calls that come in all the time. I talked to a pizza delivery guy who couldn't reach his destination because a defiant chicken was standing in the middle of the road. I stayed with him on the phone as he pleaded with it to finally move along. Truly a chicken crossing the road moment. Another time, I took a call where a guy insisted he was in an argument with a man dressed as a giant Pepsi bottle. He said the man in the Pepsi suit had stolen his debit card and refused to give it back. Upon a ramble, the officers told me he was high as shit and arguing with a vending machine. Had a grown man calling in about a monster trying to get into his son's room. He's the right kind of frantic where I know it's not a mental health crisis, but I still couldn't figure it out. Well, he's a Middle Eastern male with a real thick accent, and I was having a hard time understanding, so he gave the phone to his son. The monster had climbed a tree and was at his bedroom window, and it was as big as my dog, and it had hands like him but tiny. Wait, what? Right there, I told the kid to see if it had rings on his tail. Yes. They had just moved to America a month ago and had never heard of raccoons. I couldn't mute myself fast enough and the father heard me laughing. I think that's what helped calm him down. I explained what a trash panda was and welcomed him to our wild jungle. A caller called in because they got their head stuck in a pat tree with the cat stuck inside with it. Throughout the call, I kept hearing like, "Ow, fuck," and "Dude, this isn't fun for me either." "Dude, I know, fuck." "Dude."
caller ended up going to a hospital for a minor case of serious head lacerations. Okay, I don't really know the severity, but I'm sure they got some stitches. The other cool thing was that the caller was using an Apple Watch to call 911 because obviously they wouldn't be able to hold the phone to their ear. We get about a dozen misdials from Apple Watches every day. It was nice to see one being used for real. A man requiring extrication from an Under Armour insulated shirt. His shoulder popped out of the socket while he was pulling it on. It was halfway on, halfway off, and his arm was locked and dislocated. Edited to add so you don't think I'm awful, he was laughing and said, "I would have driven myself to the hospital, but I would have had to drive with my arm out the window." Numerous calls where someone has handcuffed themselves to an SO during coitus and lost the key. If it's not busy, this seems to draw most available officers. Not me, but my coworker, a person was pleasuring themselves with the handle of a scissors and it got stuck. A little kid called 911 because he wanted the cops to come arrest his brother. You see, their mom said that the caller's brother was supposed to share the Legos, but he wasn't sharing. The caller's brother said that he was playing with all the Legos, which wasn't possible. There were too many Legos for one person to play with all of them at once, argued our caller. Therefore, his brother was a liar, a jerk, and a turd, and we needed to come and arrest him. We had a high degree of confidence this wasn't a coded request for help, so we asked to speak to an adult, confirmed there was no distress, and closed the case. Share your Legos, kids. P.S. If your kid ever calls 911, don't get mad at them. We want them to call 911 if they think they should. We would much rather them call 911 for something silly than have them not call when they should because they're afraid they'll get in trouble. A guy called in because his dog had bitten a seagull and was now acting strange. He demanded we find the bird, capture it, and test it for rabies. The whole circumstances were vague and he was unwilling to listen to reasonable advice like that birds can't carry rabies. He had the audacity to file a complaint when informed we would not be doing what he wanted. I was a 911 dispatcher years ago, but had two specific calls that still make me laugh. A frazzled mother called because her 6-year-old had gotten into the roof and she couldn't get him down. She kept screaming about how we need to hurry, not because she was worried he would get hurt, but because he had done this before and last time he peed in the air vents. This was before weed was legal in my state, but a college kid called asking for an ambulance. He was super worried that he was having an allergic reaction to the weed he just smoked. When asked what his symptoms were, he said, "I just can't stop eating Cheetos." Not me, but my wife, who works both as a secretary for a fire department and is a volunteer firefighter in DMT. A lady calls asking if she can donate a building for a training burn-in. After asking questions, she finds out it's not a building, but an RV. More questions, it's not her RV, it was abandoned on her property. Just a few more questions. It's not exactly abandoned, it's her ex-husband's RV, and he's living in it and won't leave. She wants my wife's fire department to burn it down. My wife's fire department declined.
Thanks for watching. Have you ever had to call emergency services for something ridiculous? Let's hear it in the comments.